In December of 1692, a man named Abraham Foster walked to the Salem jail to collect his mother. She had died in her cell weeks earlier, cold, condemned, never hanged. They would not release her body. Not until he paid £2, 10 shillings, for the return of a corpse. That is where this story actually lives. Not in the courtroom, in the ledger. Because the panic was religious, but the bill was itemized. We know Salem as a fever. 19 people hanged. One old man pressed to death under a pile of stones for refusing to enter a plea. A village of farmers and their daughters convinced that their neighbors were flying through the winter dark to torment them. All of that is true. The fear was real. The grief was real. Nobody in this story is pretending, but underneath the fever, something quieter was running. Something with columns and totals and a due date. For every accusation, a woman was moved from a home into a cell. And a cell, in colonial Massachusetts, was not free. Someone forged the chains. Someone measured out the bread. Someone kept a running account of exactly how long each frightened person had been alive inside the state's custody and sent the invoice to that person's family. This is the part of Salem that doesn't fit on a tombstone. Follow it. And the holy panic starts to look like something else. Something with a business model. Let's be precise about what this is and what it isn't. Nobody in Salem sat down and invented a scheme to get rich off witches. There was no founder, no master plan, no villain rubbing his hands in a back room. That's the lazy version, and it's wrong. What happened is stranger and honestly more unsettling. An existing machine, the ordinary, unremarkable machinery of colonial justice, was suddenly fed hundreds of bodies, and it did what it was built to do. It charged for them. Here is the human need at the center of it. Not greed, fear. A community terrified of an invisible enemy wanted that enemy contained, locked up, kept away from their children. That desire, make us safe, is one of the oldest things a person can feel, and it's the demand that every jail on earth is built to satisfy. But a jail is not a moral instrument. It's a service, and services get billed. So the market that appears in Salem in 1692 isn't a market in witches. It's a market in custody, in the days a human being spends locked in a room. The product was time, measured, and chained. And the terrible efficiency of it was that the person being sold this service was the same person forced to consume it. The panic was religious. The bill was itemized. Hold on to that, because it only gets more literal from here. To see the machine, you have to look at the paperwork it left behind, and, remarkably, much of it survived. The expense accounts of the men who ran these jails still exist. Preserved in the Salem archives, written in the flat bookkeeping hand of people who genuinely believed they were just doing their jobs. Start with the basic rate. In the Boston prison, the keeper charged 2 shillings and 6 pence a week simply to hold a prisoner. Not to feed them well, not to warm them, just to keep them there. 2 and 6 a week, which, in that economy, was roughly what a working woman could hope to earn in a week. Read that again slowly. The cost of being imprisoned for a week was about a week of a free woman's labor. You were being charged, in full, for the privilege of the room they had dragged you into. And the charges didn't stop at the walls of the room. They reached your wrists. Because the accused paid for their own chains. There is a line, still legible, for 14 shillings chains for Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, 2 of the very first women accused. Another for a pair of irons for a prisoner named Mary Cox. A blacksmith billed 16 shillings and 6 pence for fetters for 3 more. This is not a metaphor, and I want to be careful not to soften it into one. The iron that held a woman down in the dark was itemized, priced, and added to the tab she would be expected to settle before she could ever go home. Then the food. Prisoners paid the keeper for their own meals, and if they couldn't, they got bread and water and were charged for that too. The keeper also drew a fee from the court, 5 shillings a head. And the accused were assessed, on top of everything, for the wider apparatus, the magistrate's time, the sheriff's expenses, the work of the hangman himself. Let that land. A condemned person, in some accounting, was helping to pay the salary of the man who would hang them. Now, you're going to want a number you can feel. 2 and 6, is that $10? 100? 500? And here I have to be straight with you, because this is where a lot of history gets sloppy. There is no honest single answer. You'll see confident conversions online, and almost all of them are guesses wearing a suit. The value of silver in 1692, the price of bread, the wage of a laborer, the sheer scarcity of hard coin in a cash-poor colony. None of it maps cleanly onto a modern dollar. Anyone who hands you one tidy number is selling you false precision. So I'll refuse the fake answer and give you the real one, the conversion that actually holds. A week in that cell cost about a week of a person's life earnings every week, whether or not they had done a single thing wrong. That's the exchange rate that matters, not dollars, time. The jail was denominated in the one currency the poor could never earn faster than they were being charged. Keep that in your pocket, because the whole cruelty of the machine is hidden in the gap between a bill that grows by the week and a prisoner who cannot earn a shilling while locked away from her own work. It helps to see that this wasn't a special witch tax. It was the normal plumbing of colonial justice, running at abnormal volume, and that's exactly what makes it chilling. There wasn't one jail, there were several, and each kept its own books. Boston had its prison, Salem had another, Ipswich had a third, where a woman named Rachel Clinton ran up a detention bill of £4, 10 shillings, 3 pence, the tab simply accumulating, month after month, in another clerk's ledger. Move a prisoner between towns, and the meter didn't reset, it just changed hands. Every keeper was, in effect, a small businessman whose inventory was people. And, like any small businessman, he wanted to get paid sometimes by the prisoners, sometimes by the colony, and often by neither. Consider the Salem keeper, William Downton. When the dust settled, he was chasing something like £43, 17 shillings in unpaid back salary the government owed him, and was eventually fobbed off with about 12. So picture the full shape of it. A system that billed a 4-year-old for her chains and still couldn't be bothered to pay its own jailer in full. Everyone was inside the ledger. Almost nobody was made whole by it. There was even a grim little market in temporary freedom. For a bond of roughly £1, a prisoner with means could buy a day out to see family, to settle affairs on the promise of returning to the cell by night, which tells you something precise about the whole design. Your freedom wasn't a right the verdict could restore. It was a product, and like every product in this story, it had a price. And the price was set in the one thing the accused were bleeding by the week: money they could not earn while chained. Here's the design flaw, except it wasn't a flaw, it was the whole logic. Once you understand it, you understand everything. The bill was tied to time in custody, not to guilt, not to the verdict, to the calendar. Which means the machine had no real interest in whether you were a witch. It had an interest in how many weeks you stayed, and nothing about being innocent made you leave faster. Consider a woman named Lydia Dustin. She stood trial. She was found not guilty. The court, in its own fevered way, cleared her, and she died in jail anyway, because an acquittal in Salem didn't open the door. Paying your fees opened the door. Lydia Dustin couldn't pay, so the state kept her, and she died a prisoner, cleared of the crime, still locked in the room she was too poor to be released from. The system had produced a category that should not be able to exist: the innocent debtor. Absolved of the crime, imprisoned for the cost of having been accused of it. And this is the moment I have to stop calling any of this wry, because from here it stops being clever and starts being cruel. There was a 4-year-old in the Salem jail. Her name was Dorothy Good. She was the daughter of Sarah Good, one of the first accused, one of the first hanged. When the accusers turned on the child, this 4-year-old was arrested too, and chained, because chains were thought to hold not just the body, but the flying specter they imagined lived inside it. So they ironed a toddler. And she stayed in that jail for something close to 9 months, until her father could scrape together the money to pay for her keep. A small child carried a real balance, in shillings, accruing by the week, for the crime of being her mother's daughter. Witnesses said she was never right again. Then there is Anne Foster, where we began. An old woman from Andover who confessed under pressure, was condemned, and was never executed because she died first, in her cell, in December, after 5 months inside. Her family's grief was immediate and real, and it arrived with a price tag. Her son Abraham had to pay £2, 10 shillings, before the jail would surrender his mother's body for burial. Think about what that transaction is. Not a fine, not a punishment, a retrieval fee. The institution had custody of a corpse, and custody, as always, was a billable service. Grief itself had an invoice, and it had to be settled before a son could put his mother in the ground. And then there is the woman the whole thing arguably started with. Tituba, the enslaved woman in Reverend Samuel Parris's household, whose coerced confession lit the first spark. When the fever finally burned out and the cells began to empty, she stayed. For 13 months she sat in jail, long after the panic had passed, for one reason. The man who owned her simply refused to pay her fee to get her out. Parris would not spend the money. She was finally released only when a stranger paid roughly £7 and, in the same motion, purchased her. She walked out of that jail not into freedom, but into another man's ownership. Her release and her sale, the very same transaction. The panic was religious. The bill down to the toddler's chains, and the body in the cold room, and the price of a human being was itemized. Now here's the turn, and it reorganizes the whole picture. You'd assume, if there was money in Salem, that it was in the executions, that the drama on Gallows Hill was the center of gravity. It wasn't. Think about it purely as a ledger, the way the men holding the ledgers did. A hanging ends an account. A dead witch stops accruing fees. From a pure custody standpoint, an execution is a closed invoice, the least profitable outcome the machine can produce. The living prisoner was the recurring charge, but the real money, the windfall money, was somewhere else entirely. It was in the estate. Enter George Corwin, High Sheriff of Essex County, 25 years old, holding the single most financially interesting office in the entire crisis, because the sheriff was the man who collected. And Corwin understood something about the law of his moment. An accusation was, in practice, a license to seize property, sometimes before conviction, sometimes after execution, sometimes from people who had already fled. Take Philip English, a wealthy Salem merchant. When the accusation reached him, Corwin and his men went to English's home and warehouses and carried off, by the surviving account, somewhere near £1,183 worth of goods. Furniture, silver plate, wine, lumber, grain, fish, clothing, livestock. A merchant's entire working life walked out the door. English fled and survived. His property did not come back easily, if at all. Take John Proctor, a name you might know from the play, though the play doesn't tell you this part. After the Proctors were condemned, the sheriff came for the farm. He sold off some of the livestock. The rest he slaughtered and salted, packed for shipment to the West Indies, and emptied the household. A working farm, a family's entire economic existence, rendered into salted meat and cash while the family was still in chains. Take Mary Parker, hanged in September. Corwin came for her estate, after she was already dead, seized her corn, her hay, her cattle, then demanded £6 more from her grown sons, who had tried to argue the property was rightfully theirs. He took it anyway. This is the flip. The visible business, the jail, the fees, the chains, was the cover charge. The actual value was underneath it, in the transfer of a lifetime of accumulated property out of an accused household and into the hands of the men who ran the process. The witch trial wasn't primarily a machine for killing people. It was, functionally, a machine for liquidating them, and the killing, from the ledger's cold point of view, was almost a side effect. I want to be careful and honest here, because this is exactly the kind of claim that's easy to overstate. I am not telling you that George Corwin invented the panic to steal cattle, or that the terror in those courtrooms was fake. It wasn't. The men accusing their neighbors mostly believed, with their whole hearts, in the invisible war they thought they were fighting. The material motive rode alongside the sincere terror, it didn't replace it. That's the uncomfortable truth most versions skip. You don't need a conspiracy for a system to behave like a business. You need genuine fear, a set of standing financial incentives, and no one with the power to say, stop. Salem had all three. If you want the whole logic of this compressed into a single human being, his name was Giles Corey. Corey was an 80-year-old farmer, accused and hauled toward the same machine as everyone else. But Corey did something almost no one did. He refused to plead. Not guilty, not innocent, he stood mute. And under the Old English law the court fell back on, a defendant who would not plead could not be tried. So they applied the punishment meant to force a plea, peine forte et dure. They laid him on the ground, put a board on his chest, and piled on stones, more each day, to press an answer out of him. According to the tradition, his last words were only, "More weight." He died under the rocks rather than speak. Now here's where honesty matters, because this is one of those neat stories that history loves and evidence complicates. The popular version says Corey stayed silent specifically to protect his estate, that a man who was convicted forfeited his property to the state, but a man never tried could pass his farm cleanly to his heirs. And so, the story goes, he chose to be crushed to death to keep the sheriff's hands off his land. Is that true? Historians genuinely argue about it. The legal picture in Massachusetts was murkier than the clean tale suggests, and we can't crawl inside an 80-year-old man's head 3 centuries later. So I won't sell it to you as fact. But here's what's telling and what is solid. The story was believable. It made sense to the people who told it, because they had watched Corwin strip estate after estate, and they knew with total clarity that in Salem, the fastest way to protect your family from the machine was to keep your property out of its reach. Even if Corey's exact motive is lost, the fact that he died to save his farm struck everyone as plausible tells you precisely what kind of institution they understood themselves to be living under. And after his death, the accounts still show his family settling jail costs anyway. The machine got its fee in the end. It nearly always did. So why did it end? Not because the colony suddenly recovered its conscience. The machine broke for a more revealing reason. It started billing the wrong people. For a while, the accused were who you'd expect a fearful community to turn on the poor. The widowed, the friendless, the woman who muttered at you in the road. People with no standing to fight back and not much worth seizing. A market like that can run quietly for a long time because its losers can't push back. But panic doesn't stay in its lane. The accusations climbed. They reached merchants like Philip English, with money and connections and the means to sue. They reached the educated, the well-married, eventually people connected to the governor's own circle. And the moment the net closed around people who could afford lawyers, write petitions, and make noise in Boston, the system acquired something it had never had before: powerful enemies who had personally seen the invoice. At the same time, the intellectual floor gave way. The trials had leaned heavily on so-called spectral evidence testimony that the accused's ghostly shape had done the tormenting. Influential ministers began to argue, correctly, that the devil could impersonate an innocent person's shape, which meant spectral evidence proved nothing at all. Once that was conceded, the entire evidentiary engine collapsed. Governor Phipps halted the special court, barred spectral evidence, and the remaining cases fell apart. Notice what did the work here. It wasn't mainly mercy. It was discredited evidence plus a machine that had finally reached into pockets deep enough to fight back. A predatory system tends to survive exactly as long as it only preys on people who can't respond, and not one day longer. So account for it. Who came out where? George Corwin, the sheriff who collected, was never made to give most of it back in his lifetime. He died a few years later, still a young man. And here the record hands us a story so pointed it sounds invented, so I'll flag it plainly as what it is: a persistent tradition, not a documented certainty. It's said that Philip English, still owed for everything Corwin had stripped from him, blocked the sheriff's burial, placed a claim on the very corpse until the debt was answered. True or embroidered, people told that story for a reason. The man who seized so many estates left one behind that his victims felt entitled to attach. Now the losers, and there is no wry way to say any of this. Lydia Dustin, acquitted, dead in a cell she couldn't buy her way out of. Anne Foster, dead in the dark, her body ransomed back to her son. Dorothy Good, 4 years old, chained for the better part of a year and broken by it. Tituba, sold on her way out the jailhouse door. Rebecca Nurse, a frail, well-respected grandmother whose jury first found her not guilty, then reversed under pressure, and who was hanged anyway. Her weeks of imprisonment dutifully billed at 17 shillings, 10 pence, right there in the keeper's neat account. The ledger did not distinguish between the guilty and the beloved. It only counted weeks. And the apology? It came, but it came metered too. Almost 20 years later, in 1711, Massachusetts approved restitution a total of £578 and 12 shillings to be divided among the survivors and the families of the dead. The Proctors received the largest single share, £150. It was something. It was real. But it came with a condition that tells you everything. You were only paid if you had filed a petition asking to be paid. The grief that stayed silent, the families too poor, too scattered, too broken, or too ashamed to file, was compensated at exactly nothing. Even the reckoning had an application form. And the legal clearing of names was slower and stingier still. The reversal, meant to lift the convictions, left several of the condemned women off the list entirely: Bridget Bishop, Susanna Martin, and others still formally guilty of witchcraft. Some of those names would not be officially cleared for 300 years. The state balanced its moral books the same way it had run its jail: partially, conditionally, and only for the ones who knew to ask. So hold both of these truths at once, because the honest version needs both. The fear was real. The people of Salem were not cynics playing a game. Most of them were genuinely, sincerely terrified, and their terror is the reason 19 of their neighbors died. Take nothing from that. It is a real human tragedy, and it deserves to be remembered as one. But a real tragedy can also have an accounts department. That's the thing we flinch from. We want our horrors to be pure madness, pure evil, pure faith gone wrong, because a pure horror is at least simple. Salem isn't simple. Salem is what happens when sincere fear is poured into an ordinary institution that was already, quietly, built to charge by the weak. The fear supplied the bodies. The bureaucracy supplied the invoices. Neither one had to be evil for the result to be monstrous. That's why this story should still raise the hair on your neck, 3 centuries later. Not because you believe in witches, because you understand institutions. The machinery that turned a 4-year-old's imprisonment into a line item and a dead woman's body into a retrieval fee was not exotic. It was administrative. It was normal. It was people doing their jobs and keeping good records. The witches were never real. The chains had a price. The bodies had a retrieval fee. The apology had an application form. The panic was religious. The bill was itemized. And the bill, it turns out, is the part of Salem that never really stopped being true.